look at climate change like a bear. The whole planet's been wrestling with the bear for decades. So far, the bear's been kicking our ass.
What if we were able to develop technology that would allow us to survive, maybe even thrive?
You don't know what's going to happen.
It won't go the way you want. It never does.
Hello and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Michelle Norris. I'm an opinion columnist for the Washington Post, and today we're going to talk about a series that looks at the effects of climate change. As you saw there, it appears on Apple Plus TV, and it's called Extrapolations. We're joined today by the actor Edward Norton and by the show's creator, Scott Z. Burns. He's more than just the show's creator. He's also a longtime friend of mine. We went to college together. And Scott, I'm just so proud of the work you've done here. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
So let's just dive right in. Scott, I want to begin with you if I can. You have said that you can't change people's attitudes unless you can also entertain them. Can you talk about how you talked briefly about the plot of the show and how you decided to lay out these 8 varying stories and how you also balance those two things, trying to awaken people, but also entertain them?
Yeah, I mean, I think I started from a place, which is a documentary is a bit of a self-sorting organism, and that's changing a little bit, but we've seen a lot of docs that have been made, and some are really wonderful that try and talk about the risks of climate change. We've also seen some stories that are scripted that deal with the possible outcomes, and there's a natural tendency, I think, on the part of a dramatist to look at the end of that story, and that has been covered, I think, very well by a lot of different people in literature, in film. So I was sort of interested in the messy middle, because in the messy middle, we all still have agency. And cutting to the end may have certain dramatic opportunities, but it sort of limits the opportunities for human behavior to be explored. And so that was the opening premise for this, is between now and however the climate crisis is resolved, we all are going to see this show up in our lives in very, very different ways, depending on who we are, where we live, what our resources are. And so I wanted to do a survey of all of that. And that's sort of where I started with this.
It is, we see the cataclysmic things that happen, fires all the time, the hurricane season that begins in April instead of August. But it's the smaller things that often are so telling, that when people go to synagogue, they have to wear galoshes because there's just water, on the floor all the time. The fires that are always burning in the background, as you say, the slow burn that leads up to this. You also wrote the screenplay for Contagion, which was eerily and scarily predictive of what would happen when we actually faced a global pandemic 3 years ago when that hit, right around now, actually. For those of us who saw Contagion, we were wondering, did he look into a crystal ball? Did he really, understand with that greater accuracy what was going to happen? If you could just briefly also explain sort of the predictive journalism that you do, research that you do, that you put into this film. So what we're looking at is not just sort of it is in some ways an extrapolation of what might happen if current trends continue.
Yeah, I mean, Contagion could have been named Extrapolations as well. The similarity is in process. I wanted to write a movie about viruses and how, as we encroached more and more on nature, we were going to come in contact with viruses that our bodies had maybe never met and that we hadn't had an opportunity to develop natural immunity to, and that they will, as we've seen, jump into the human species. It was something my father was frankly obsessed with. So he and I spent a lot of time towards the end of his life talking about it, and I thought, oh wow, I wonder if I can turn it into sort of a almost 70s style, disaster movie. And Steven Soderbergh liked the idea, so we we started doing that. What I learned from all those experts is really similar to what I learned talking to the experts in climate, which is it was never an issue of, will another pandemic happen? It was always just an issue of when. Now, nobody told me it would happen when it did. It's funny because Anthony Fauci actually came to the premiere of Contagion, and his biggest quibble with me was he didn't think there would be any way that we would get a vaccine that quickly. I haven't spoken to him since, but I think we actually did a pretty good job of predicting that as well. I think on extrapolations, what I learned was a little different, which is it isn't an issue of, whether or not these things are going to happen. They already are happening. When we started on the pilot, we consciously chose things that are already going on. There are already floods and fires and famines linked to drought. So we're already seeing this. The question I wanted to explore, and that the scientists who I spoke to, opined on with our writers group, was how far does it go before we decide to meet climate change with human change and stop it? How many species are we going to say goodbye to? How many cities are we going to lose to sea level change? How many of the people in the global south are we going to lose? What are we going to do with, climate-driven displacement of people? All of those things. Those were the more human issues that we wanted to tackle here.
Let's bring Edward into the conversation. I've been doing interviews a long time, and I have always wanted to talk to you. This is such, I'm excited about the opportunity
Thanks,
to have a
happy to be here.
conversation. Was this also an opportunity for you of sorts, not just to take on an interesting role, but to in some ways act your values, live your values, do something that aligned with your core values in life when you decided to play a character who is a scientist who is trying to save the world in part by preventing this thing called solar geoengineering, which many people might not know what that is, but I assume that in coming years we're going to learn a lot more about that. What did this role mean to you?
Sure. Although, one of the things I like most about what Scott and his team did with the text of this whole series is that it's not a Jeremiad. It's not sort of a soapbox with an assertion of values. It actually really is a meditation on how much uncertainty is intrinsically embedded within these scientific questions, ethical questions, societal questions. And so to the degree you say, like, was it a chance to act my values? It's like, well, yes and no. It like, it's not an assertion of a position, but I think that simply being a part of an imaginative provocation, I think it's healthy without taking a position. I don't even think you have to take a position for it to be healthy, to get people to put their minds toward the contemplation of what the implications of this particular set of challenges are. We need to be meditating on it. We need to be thinking ahead more. We need to be grappling with the quotidian details of life that could be altered and as a result of what's coming. And I guess I feel sometimes I think the best thing art can do is kind of get us to reflect on who we are and where we are, Spike Lee used to always say to me, a great film asks a lot more questions than it answers, and I think that's a very rich component of this series as ways. It provokes a lot of questions. It provokes a lot of contemplation, meditation. I don't think it's a lecture at all. And I think and I love that. I've always loved to be a part of drama that provokes questions, uh, and and leaves people to contemplate what they think the answers might be.
It's interesting is there are questions that are actually built into the script at several points where people are asking, why is this happening? Or what can we do? Or, that, and they're asking that of another character that I can see in the way that this is constructed, that you're really asking that question of the audience. Where am I in this? If I'm alive in 2047, what will I have done to prevent what I'm seeing on the screen right now? There's a clip that I want to
Yeah.
introduce. It has Edward, your character, Jonathan Chopin. He is talking to his ex-wife, Gita, who is on a mission that seemed like it was a groundbreaking mission, and it turns out to be something quite different. And this is where, in the series, we're introduced to this idea of geoengineering. Let's listen to the clip, and then we'll come right back.
What'll happen to the ozone layer? You don't know. What'll happen to the oceans? You don't know. The 2 billion people you say you're trying to save, you're about to drop another climate volatility event right on their heads. How does that?
But the real reckless experiment is the one civilization has been running. Adding carbon to the atmosphere, adding plastic to the ocean, removing species from ecosystems.
Nobody was trying to change the climate. We didn't even think that we had that capacity. We didn't know better, but we do now.
And yet, human behavior doesn't change. The sky is easier to re-engineer than the human brain, John.
Exactly. And if you tell that greedy monkey brain it's cooled off and everything's okay, it's gonna say, give me a little bit more. Just let me burn a little bit more. Just let me mortgage a little more of the children's future so that I can make sure I can juice this quarterly balance sheet. I just need that one. It's Gita. Even if you got all of the chemical interactions right, if you got the dispersal pattern right, the problem here is bigger than the heat of the sun, Gita. It's the way we see the world.
The character Gita is trying to engage in something akin to cloud seeding, and that line is incredible. That line in the script, that the sky is easier to engineer than the human brain. What do you want audiences to take from that exchange in particular? Because that seemed to be really key to that particular episode.
It's interesting because what happens next in that scene is, we get to meet Edward's son. And to me, writing this, again, going back to trying to take something big and make it more relatable, you learn about his relationship with his son, and how Jonathan's character changes his relationship to the science of geoengineering, which is a tricky thing because, like a lot of technology, it's very hard to imagine human beings foregoing a quick and easy fix. We seem to like those. And we might be able to slow the temperature from getting warmer. But I think what's interesting is, as this episode goes on, is to hear the dynamic between a father and a son about, how do we manage this? How does an adult change their mind about an issue in front of their child? So, it's interesting watching that scene because it's probably the biggest confrontation maybe in the whole series about our reliance on technology. I don't even know that I can take credit for that line. That Edward may have actually improv that. I'm not sure.
In Edward, there's a scene also where you sit down and you're on the phone, and at this point in the future, it's almost like this Alvin Toffler thing where we're looking at what our technology will look like in the future, and everything is a hologram, and you're able to immediately call up an experiment that your son did, and you realize that this has been living in his brain for some time, this idea of this geoengineering, was part of the message in that particular scene and your whole relationship with your son to send a message that our children are watching us? Edward, was that one of the things that was present in your mind as you're playing this
I
role?
Yeah, I thought again, Scott and his team, I thought not just in that episode, but I think it's woven all through the anthology is the idea that, the question of who should be making these decisions in some sense. And I think it's, you look at incredibly passionate young activists like Greta Thunberg and others who catch so much shade from older generations for being loud, for being fierce, for being insistent. And it's kind of I think the series has woven into it that tension to a high degree. The idea that younger people waiting on the incremental moves of older people is a there's something wrong with that. That there's a and I like it. You know, in the human drama of it, I like that the character I play is affected. He's affected by that idea that maybe at the end of the day, it's not it, it, it's something that has to be granted to a younger generation that right or wrong, risky or not, they ultimately it's right that they call the shot in a situation of uncertainty. And I think I think that it if one thing if one thing uh, comes through the series that I think is really disturbing, it's that as you see the years marching on, if as you imagine the future unfolding, and you realize that there's a lot of goodwill, there's a lot of attention being paid, but that this is ramping so fast on us that we don't have the time for incrementalism, and that incrementalism will is not going to win. It becomes it kind of creates a knot in your stomach, because you you look around and you realize that in our social challenges there are many things that we can afford the timeline of incrementalism. You could say that in social justice and civil rights, right? Everybody wants things to move faster. Everybody wants to achieve equity and justice. There isn't an intrinsic catastrophic effect to, as Martin Luther King said, to the arc being long but bending toward justice. Where the climate is concerned and where the environment is concerned, you don't have infinite timelines, and incrementalism literally may actually, unfortunately, fade us to the more catastrophic outcomes. And I think, and that's tough, because you realize, I think the series deals with the fact that our social structures don't favor boldness. We don't tend to I mean, barring cataclysmic events like fascism and world wars, we struggle to get together around things, especially when it's at odds with our short-term interests. And as my character says, the monkey brain that just wants to maximize all the time, is really short-circuiting our own ability to move boldly. And it's kind of a dire conundrum, that our makeup versus the needs of the moment.
There's a whole interesting body of research on risk aversion, and how people just will do things that are not in their best interest because risk is just too scary for them. You mentioned that famous Dr. King quote. Our former Attorney General Eric Holder has added an addendum to that I actually rather quite like, that the arc of moral justice, the arc of the universe bends toward justice, but only if we reach out and grab it. It is not guaranteed that it will bend
Right.
without human action. Let's bring in a listener. We love our viewers and our listeners because they're very interactive. And we have a question from a gentleman from Walter. His name is Walter. He lives in Virginia, and he asks, how does the show address the climate equity problem? The people least responsible for causing climate change will likely suffer the most from its consequences.
I will go first. Please watch this Friday's episode, because what it explores is exactly what happens in the Oval Office. There's a decision that's made at the end of Edward's episode, and we see the ramifications of that played out in the global South. And when you watch these negotiations unfold, look, you can take whatever position you want on someone like Modi, but India has the opportunity to be an economic powerhouse if they burn a lot of coal. So when we ask them to forego that, how does that feel? That we had a 150-year head start with cheap energy to build our economies, and we're just supposed to say, hey, sorry, that was unfortunate on our part, but you can't do that. And so I think we do really take that part of the problem very seriously, because we are now going to have to all work together, even though, exactly as you point out, this problem hasn't visited all of us equally. And unfortunately, a lot of these issues, sea level change, in particular, drought, these are going to be visited on the global South and on people who do not have the economic resources. There's a line in that episode where Indira Varma, who plays Geeta, says, I'm imagining you're all sitting in an air-conditioned room right now. So that is a huge part of the story, and I'm grateful for your question.
Edward, did you want to answer Walter also?
No, I agreed. I think that is that the 5th episode
Yeah.
that follows on mine? Yeah, that whole episode takes place in India, and it's incredibly vivid. I thought that was one of my favorite episodes, honestly, is the imagining of the impacts of conversations in one place being really physically imagined and realized in another, and it's very gripping, that episode.
At last year's World Travel and Tourism Council Global Summit, Edward, you said that the challenge of our era is climate change and sustainability. And as we noted, you are now a UN ambassador for biodiversity. In a film like this, you're taking on the kind of topics that are the subject of white papers and diplomatic roundtables. And you're taking this and interpreting it in a way that an audience that is watching this for entertainment on a Friday night, watching it with their kids, watching it on a little device while they're on a plane, can take it in and understand it. What role does that, how does your role as a biodiversity ambassador mesh with your role as an entertainer, as an actor in Hollywood? Is it a challenge to bridge those two things, or does it enrich what you do in some ways and give you a second sight?
I think that narrative and storytelling are components of a lot of this work. Biodiversity in particular is a very, by definition, sort of scientific academic idea. A lot of people in modern life, certainly in modern urban life, don't experience their daily, a sense of connectivity to biodiversity in their daily lives. And I think in the first 100 years of environmental advocacy, biodiversity concerns were expressed as like elephant extinction or lion extinction, the World Wildlife Fund's panda, kind of iconic macrofauna species, and the idea that there would be a spiritual sort of intrinsic loss if we lost those species. I think that in the 21st century, we've got to understand biodiversity in a more sophisticated way. We've got to understand biodiversity as intrinsically intertwined with our entire global economy. I like the example of pollinators. Like there's no technology that can replicate what bees do for our agricultural industry. With $1 trillion, you couldn't replicate what pollinators do, and the impacts to not just what you would see on the grocery store shelves, but literally the viability of our agricultural system if we experience ongoing collapse of pollinators is really catastrophic. So I think whether as a narrative, dramatic storyteller, or within the context of trying to help talk about biodiversity in ways that illuminate it, I think a lot of it is just narrative. It's about that's what I think is compelling about. I'm not a scientist. I'm not. I've got a long-standing immersion in environmental issues, but I think sometimes these complicated issues need people to articulate them in accessible ways. You need to draw mental pictures for people. You need to create lines of create consciousness of the lines that connect you to these academic ideas, and a lot of that's just about framing it in a narrative sense.
It happens in such subtle ways in this series. There's a character played by Sienna Miller who notes in one of the early episodes, the bees are all gone. I mean, it's not like a thunderbolt or anything. It's just like it happened. They were here. The pollinators are all gone. Scott, when you produced this film, was there any discussion about having some sort of warning attached to it? Because it is, I mean, it's one of the most disturbing things I've ever seen. And often when I say that, the next question is, don't go see it. But in this case, it's one of the most disturbing things I've seen. And I want everybody to see it because I think that people need to see and respond to this. So I guess it's a two-part question. Should there have been a warning? And what do you want people to do on the other side of viewing this?
Wow, that's a lot. We do have a website at the end of the show that you can go where we offer, people who are affected by climate-related anxiety. It's become a whole field. I can tell you that in my experience, and I'm someone who has spent a fair amount of time immersed in not only the science, but imagining what the science portends. Like the best I've felt in the last few years is going to work every day with a bunch of people who talked about and focused on these problems. And so I think like any movement, community and company and storytelling are what galvanize us and protect us. When people talk about, well, geez, what about hope? To me, you just got to start replacing the word hope with the word courage, and find characters and examples of people who had courage in the face of difficulty. And that circles back to storytelling. People may not think of Erin Brockovich as a climate or environmental film, and yet it really is, because we met someone who is from a certain background, who made a series of choices and took on, a big bad company. So, that's the first part is I think, you do have the power against this. You really do. And the narrative that you've been fed, sadly, is very similar to the narrative that, we're watching again, that we can't do anything about assault rifles. We can't do anything about racism. We're hopelessly divided over abortion. And so all of these things somehow are supposed to be taken away from me as a storyteller. And I really wonder where that leads us as a society, because I learned a lot about the world around me from a movie like Serpico. I learned about corruption. All of the movies that I've learned, Edward's movie that took on white supremacy was incredibly interesting to me and helped illuminate that. If we make everything that's challenging something that needs to have a warning label, I really worry about, the future of storytelling. I don't think that it exists merely as escapism, because if we keep using it just as escapism, the place that we have to return to afterwards is just going to get worse and worse.
And Edward, since this is essentially your hometown news organization, since you grew up in Columbia, Maryland, we're going to claim you. Do you want to have the last word?
Baltimore might have something
sharing...
to say about that, but
Oh, okay, all right. Well,
just kidding.
I'm not going to
No.
wade in that water, but I'm just going to claim you.
I grew up with the Post on my doorstep.
Do you want to have the last word on what you hope people will do after seeing this film?
I think that, there are always there's those kind of bromides of like, what are the little things each of us can do. I hate to say it, but I personally hope that people will vote this issue more. I think that the place that we see real incrementalism, real dangerous incrementalism, is in the sphere of national and international policy. We continue to see attempts to roll back environmental regulation, and frankly, the incentive structures to move beyond carbon based economy are just still not what they ought to be. And I want using LED light bulbs instead of incandescents to be what tips the balance, but it isn't. We need political will, and I think that we need to continually make it a priority to bring political leadership to bear on these. Bring in political leadership that takes this stuff seriously, and maybe that's a generational shift. I don't know, but also I really do think there's value. Nothing moves as fast as we want, but I think there's value in more and more people absorbing that this is the moment that we're living in. This is going to define the way people look at us in the future. The decision makers are going to eclipse all of our geopolitical squabbles, all of our social squabbles about what are American values. Like, it will all look like idle dinner table chat while a house was burning if we don't prioritize this discussion. And so to me, every measure of provocation, whether it's documentary or dramatic, that gets people thinking in a dynamic way about what's coming for us and what we ought to do about it, is healthy right now.
That's an important point. The notion that this is happening right now, the very definition of extrapolation is the action of estimating or concluding or making some sort of conclusion based on existing trends, based on things that are actually happening right now. Thank you so much for your work on this. Edward Norton, Scott Z. Burns, appreciate that you took time to talk to us. The show is Extrapolations. You can find it on Apple TV+, and I do hope you find it. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
And to check out what interviews we have coming up, please go to WashingtonPostLive.com. You'll find a full schedule there. I'm Michelle Norris. Thanks for being with us.